When Savannah demanded to know how I'd outsmarted her, I simply said the police would be here in 10 minutes to arrest her. The look of pure terror on her face was worth every sleepless night she'd caused me. The morning started like any other Tuesday. I was sitting at my kitchen table, savoring my second cup of coffee, and working on the crossword puzzle Thomas and I used to do together every morning. The autumn sunlight streamed through the lace curtains I'd hung 30 years ago, casting familiar shadows across the worn wooden table where we'd shared thousands of meals and conversations. That peaceful moment shattered when I heard a car door slam outside. Through my kitchen window, I watched my son Brandon climb out of his pickup truck, but he wasn't alone. A tall woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and designer clothes stepped out of the passenger side, carrying what looked like a briefcase and a tablet. I'd never seen her before in my life. Behind them, Brandon was unloading cardboard boxes from the truck bed. My stomach tightened with an inexplicable sense of dread. Something about the woman's confident stride and the way she surveyed my property made me uneasy. She walked like she owned the place. Hey, beautiful soul. Before we dive in, show some love with a like, tap subscribe, and tell me, where in this big, beautiful world are you watching from? I set down my coffee cup and moved to the front door, expecting Brandon to knock as he always did. Instead, I heard his key turning in the lock. The door swung open, and Brandon walked in without his usual cheerful greeting, followed by this stranger, who immediately began looking around my home with calculating eyes. "Mom, we need to talk," Brandon said, his voice carrying an unfamiliar formality that made my heart race. "This is Savannah Reed. She's here to help with your situation." My situation. I stared at this woman who was now standing in my living room, her manicured fingers already pulling documents from her briefcase. She had cold blue eyes and a smile that never reached them. Everything about her screamed expensive, from her designer handbag to her perfectly applied makeup. "Hello, Eleanor," Savannah said, extending her hand with practiced warmth. "Brandon has told me so much about you. I can see why he's concerned about you managing this large property all by yourself." Concerned? I looked at my son, searching his face for some explanation, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. Instead, he was nodding along as Savannah continued speaking. "I specialize in helping families navigate difficult transitions," she said, setting her briefcase on my coffee table as if she belonged there. "Brandon and I have been discussing your financial security and living arrangements. Given your age and the size of this property, we believe it's time to make some protective changes." The words hit me like physical blows. Financial security? Protective changes? I was 68 years old, not 98. I managed my own bills, maintained my home, and had been living independently since Thomas died 2 years ago. "What kind of changes?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Savannah's smile widened, but it felt predatory. "Well, first we need to transfer the property and major assets into a more secure arrangement. I have experience in estate management, and I'll be handling the transition to ensure everything is properly protected. We've already begun the paperwork." I felt the room spinning. "Transition to what?" "To my oversight," Savannah said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "For your protection, of course. Brandon agrees that you need professional management of your affairs. Starting today, I'll be making the major financial decisions and property arrangements." I looked at my son, the boy I'd raised, the man I'd sacrificed my retirement savings to help when his business struggled. "Brandon, what is she talking about?" He finally met my eyes, and what I saw there broke my heart. There was no warmth, no filial love, just cold determination mixed with what looked like greed. "Mom, you're 68 years old, living alone in this big house," he said, echoing Savannah's earlier words. "You can't handle everything by yourself anymore. Savannah knows what's best for situations like this. She's going to take care of everything, so you don't have to worry." As I stood there in my own living room, watching this stranger rifle through papers that would apparently sign away my independence. One thought echoed in my mind. My son brought a woman to my house and said she owns everything now, but he had no idea what I'd already done the night before. As I stood there watching this stranger invade my home, my mind drifted back to 1978, when Thomas and I first walked through this house with our real estate agent. Brandon was just 6 years old then, running from room to room, claiming the largest bedroom as his own, while Thomas and I exchanged knowing smiles. We could barely afford the mortgage, but Thomas squeezed my hand and whispered, "This is where we'll build our life, Ellie. This is where our boy will grow up." He was right. Every corner of this house held memories that Savannah could never understand or appreciate. The kitchen, where I'd taught Brandon to crack eggs for Sunday morning pancakes, inevitably getting more shell in the bowl than not. The living room, where we'd gathered every Christmas morning. The tree always slightly crooked, because Thomas insisted on cutting our own from the lot down the road. The master bedroom, where Thomas and I had whispered our dreams to each other during countless late-night conversations, planning Brandon's future, our retirement, the grandchildren we hoped to spoil someday. After Thomas graduated from Teachers College, we'd slowly transformed this house into our sanctuary. He built the deck where we'd spend summer evenings, added the window seat in the breakfast nook, where I'd grade papers while he coached Brandon's Little League team. Together, we'd planted the oak tree in the front yard that now towered over the roof, its branches having sheltered 3 decades of birthday parties, graduation celebrations, and quiet family moments. When Thomas died 2 years ago, suddenly and without warning, from a massive heart attack at 66, this house became more than just my home. It became my refuge, the place where I could still feel his presence. I'd kept his coffee mug in the same spot on the counter, left his reading glasses on the nightstand, maintained the garden exactly as he'd designed it. This wasn't just property to be managed or assets to be protected. This was the physical embodiment of our love story. Brandon had been my rock during those first devastating months of widowhood. He'd handled the funeral arrangements when I was too broken to think clearly, helped me navigate the maze of insurance policies and legal documents, and visited twice a week to check on me and help with household repairs. We'd grown closer than we'd been since his teenage years, bonding over shared grief and memories of the man we both loved. That's why it had felt natural to help him when his construction business started struggling last year. Brandon had always been a dreamer, like his father, but not always practical about money. When he came to me with tears in his eyes, explaining how a major contract had fallen through and he was facing bankruptcy, I didn't hesitate. Thomas would have wanted me to help our son achieve his dreams. I'd walked into the bank and liquidated my entire retirement account, handing Brandon a check for $80,000. When that wasn't enough to save the business, I'd co-signed for a business loan for another $120,000. It represented nearly every penny Thomas and I had saved over 40 years of careful living. But I told myself it was an investment in Brandon's future, in our family's future. "Mom, I'll pay you back every cent with interest," he'd promised, hugging me tight in this very living room. "Dad would be so proud of you for believing in me." For months afterward, he'd been the attentive son I remembered from childhood. He'd call every Sunday without fail, stop by with groceries, and spend hours listening to me share memories of his father. I'd begun to believe that grief had brought us closer together, that we were building a new relationship as adults who truly understood and supported each other. Then, 4 months ago, everything changed when he met Savannah Reed at some networking event. Suddenly, his Sunday calls became sporadic. His visits grew shorter and less frequent. When he did come by, she was usually with him, sitting quietly, but observing everything with those calculating eyes. At first, I'd tried to welcome her. I understood that Brandon needed companionship, and at 42, he deserved happiness after his divorce 3 years earlier. But something about Savannah never felt right. She asked too many questions about my finances, made subtle comments about the burden of maintaining such a large property, and had a way of steering conversations toward my vulnerability as an elderly widow living alone. Looking back now, I could see how methodically she'd been gathering information. The innocent questions about my insurance policies, the concerned observations about my living alone with so many valuable antiques, the gentle suggestions that I might be forgetting things or becoming overwhelmed by responsibilities that had never troubled me before. Most painful of all was watching my son transform under her influence. The Brandon who'd held my hand at his father's funeral was being replaced by a stranger who spoke in corporate jargon about asset protection and risk management. The boy who'd once defended me fiercely against playground bullies was now nodding along as this woman questioned my mental capacity. As I stood there in my kitchen, watching Savannah sort through what appeared to be legal documents designed to strip away my independence, I felt Thomas's presence more strongly than I had since his death. I could almost hear his voice whispering the words he'd said to me countless times during our marriage. "Ellie, you're stronger than you know. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small. This house, these memories, this life we'd built together, it was all worth fighting for. And fight I would." The changes had been so gradual that I'd initially dismissed them as normal adjustments to a new relationship. When Brandon first started bringing Savannah to our weekly dinners 2 months after they met, I'd been genuinely happy for him. He seemed lighter, more optimistic about his business prospects, and I attributed that to finding love again after his difficult divorce. But Savannah had a way of inserting herself into conversations that felt both natural and unsettling. During our first dinner together, while I was serving my famous pot roast, she'd complimented the dining room before casually asking, "Eleanor, have you had this beautiful china appraised recently? Pieces like this can be quite valuable, and you should make sure they're properly insured." At the time, I'd thought it was thoughtful of her to be concerned about my belongings. The china had belonged to Thomas's grandmother, and I'd never considered having it evaluated. But something about the way her eyes lingered on each piece, mentally cataloging and calculating, made me uncomfortable. The questions became more frequent and more pointed. During Brandon's birthday dinner, she'd admired the family photographs lining the hallway before asking about my insurance coverage. "I hope you have adequate protection for all these family heirlooms and memories," she'd said with apparent concern. "At your age, Eleanor, you really can't be too careful about protecting your assets. At your age." The phrase had stung because I was only 68, hardly ancient, and I'd been managing my own affairs perfectly well since Thomas died. But Savannah had a way of delivering these comments with such sweet concern that questioning them felt churlish. She'd begun staying after Brandon left, offering to help with dishes while pumping me for information about my daily routines. "Do you ever get lonely in this big house?" she'd ask, while drying my good crystal glasses. "Have you considered what would happen if you had a medical emergency with no one around to help?" These conversations always left me feeling vaguely anxious, as if I'd been living recklessly without realizing it. Savannah had a talent for planting seeds of doubt that would grow in the quiet hours after she left. Maybe I was being foolish to live alone. Maybe I was too trusting with my personal information. Maybe I needed more help than I realized. The real turning point came 6 weeks ago, during what I thought was a casual family dinner. Brandon and Savannah had arrived with a bottle of expensive wine and what seemed like genuine excitement about sharing their evening with me. But after dinner, as we sat in the living room, Savannah had pulled out her phone and begun taking photos. "I hope you don't mind," she'd said, with her practiced smile. "I'm documenting some of these beautiful pieces for insurance purposes. You really should have everything properly cataloged." She'd photographed my grandmother's silver tea service, the antique secretary desk where Thomas used to pay bills, and several paintings we'd collected over the years. When I'd asked why she was doing this, she'd explained that she had experience in estate planning and wanted to make sure I was adequately protected. Eleanor, you have no idea how often elderly people are taken advantage of because they don't properly document their assets, she'd said, her voice dripping with false concern. I've seen families lose everything because proper precautions weren't taken. Brandon had nodded along enthusiastically, adding, Mom, Savannah knows about these things. She's just trying to help. But I'd noticed how she'd focused particularly on the most valuable items and how she'd made notes in her phone after each photograph. It felt less like protection and more like inventory. The phone calls started soon after, always when Brandon wasn't around, always with some urgent concern about my well-being. She'd call on Monday mornings, claiming she'd driven by and noticed I hadn't brought in my newspaper yet, wondering if I was feeling all right. She'd call on rainy evenings, expressing worry about me being alone during storms. I hope you don't mind me checking on you, she'd say. But at your age, living alone in such a large house, well, anything could happen. The subtle message was always the same. I was vulnerable, I was at risk, and I needed protection that only she could provide. Last week, I'd overheard a phone conversation that chilled me to the bone. Savannah had been in my bathroom, thinking the door provided privacy, when her phone rang. Through the thin walls, I'd heard her side of what was clearly a business conversation. The timeline is perfect, she'd said, in a voice completely different from her usual sugary tone. The son is completely on board, and the old woman trusts him completely. She's isolated, recently widowed, and has way more assets than he even realizes. We just need to move before she gets suspicious or involves any lawyers. My blood had turned to ice. Old woman, timeline, assets. This wasn't about helping me or protecting me. This was about taking everything Thomas and I had worked for our entire lives. That night, I'd lain awake staring at the ceiling, finally seeing the pattern I'd been too trusting to recognize. The gradual isolation from my friends through subtle suggestions that they were taking advantage of my generosity. The constant reinforcement that I was vulnerable and needed protection. The systematic cataloging of my possessions and probing into my financial affairs. Savannah Reed wasn't my son's girlfriend who cared about my well-being. She was a predator who had identified me as her next victim. And she was using my own son as the weapon to destroy me. The most heartbreaking realization was that Brandon couldn't see it. Or worse, maybe he could see it, but had chosen to ignore it because he stood to benefit from my downfall. Either way, I knew I was running out of time to protect myself. The confrontation I'd been dreading came on a gray October afternoon, when Brandon and Savannah arrived unannounced with what looked like an attorney's briefcase and a folder thick with official documents. I'd been reading in Thomas's old leather chair by the window, trying to lose myself in a mystery novel, when I heard their car pull into the driveway. This time, there was no pretense of a social visit. Savannah marched into my living room like she owned it, spreading papers across my coffee table with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. Brandon followed behind her, his face a mask I didn't recognize, avoiding my eyes as he positioned himself between me and the front door. Eleanor, we need to discuss your living situation, Savannah announced without preamble, her voice stripped of its usual false sweetness. Brandon and I have been consulting with legal experts about your capacity to continue managing your affairs independently. My capacity. The word hit me like a slap across the face. What are you talking about? I manage my affairs perfectly well. Savannah exchanged a meaningful look with Brandon before opening the folder. I'm afraid that's not entirely accurate. Brandon has documented several concerning incidents over the past few months. Forgotten appointments, unpaid bills, confusion about simple financial matters. That's not true, I said, looking at my son in shock. Brandon, tell her that's not true. For the first time since they'd arrived, Brandon met my eyes, and what I saw there made my heart shatter. There was no warmth, no love, just cold calculation mixed with what looked like guilt he was trying to suppress. Mom, You did forget about the dentist appointment last month, he said quietly. And you seemed confused when we discussed your property taxes. I rescheduled the dentist appointment because I had a cold, I protested. And I wasn't confused about property taxes. I was questioning why you suddenly needed to know about them. Savannah pulled out a thick legal document and placed it in front of me. These are power of attorney papers, Eleanor. They'll allow me to manage your financial affairs and make important decisions about your care and living arrangements. It's really for your own protection. I stared at the papers, the legal language swimming before my eyes, as the full scope of their plan became clear. You want me to sign over control of everything I own to someone I barely know. You know me well enough, Savannah said coolly. I have extensive experience in elder care transitions. I've helped dozens of families navigate these difficult situations. Elder care transitions. The phrase made my skin crawl. I don't need elder care. I need you to leave my house. Brandon stepped forward, his voice taking on a patronizing tone I'd never heard from him before. Mom, be reasonable. You're 68 years old, living alone in a house that's too big for you. You've been making questionable financial decisions, and we're worried about your safety. Questionable financial decisions? You mean helping you save your business? You gave away our inheritance without consulting anyone, he said. And there it was. The real issue. Not my well-being or my safety, but their inheritance. Savannah smiled triumphantly. Exactly. Giving away large sums of money without proper consideration is a classic sign of diminished capacity. That's why we need to act quickly to protect what's left of your estate. Protect what's left for whom? I wanted to ask, but the words stuck in my throat as Savannah continued. Now, we can do this the easy way or the hard way, Eleanor. You can sign these documents voluntarily, which will allow you to remain in a designated room of this house under supervised care. Or we can pursue legal guardianship through the courts, which would likely result in you being placed in a state facility while we sort out the financial mess you've created. The threat hung in the air like poison. I looked at my son, searching for any sign of the boy I'd raised, the man who'd held my hand at his father's funeral and promised to always take care of me. Brandon, this is your mother you're talking about. The woman who gave birth to you, raised you, supported you through every crisis. How can you stand there and let this stranger threaten me? For a moment, his mask slipped, and I saw a flicker of the sun I remembered. But then Savannah placed her hand on his arm, and his expression hardened again. Mom, this isn't a threat. It's reality. You're not capable of making these decisions anymore. And I won't stand by and watch you destroy everything Dad worked for. Everything Dad worked for. The irony was crushing. Thomas would have thrown them both out of the house and probably called the police. Thomas would have protected me from these vultures who were circling our life's work like carrion birds. You have 24 hours to think about it, Savannah said, gathering her papers with practiced efficiency. But understand, Eleanor, this is happening whether you cooperate or not. The only question is whether you want to maintain some dignity in the process. Dignity. As if there was anything dignified about being robbed by your own child, and a woman who targeted you like a predator targets prey. After they left, I sat in the silence of my violated home, feeling more alone than I had even in the darkest days after Thomas's death. Then, at least, I'd had Brandon's love and support. Now I had nothing but the cold reality that my son had chosen money over his mother, and that everything Thomas and I had built together was about to be stolen by strangers. But as I sat there in the gathering darkness, I remembered something Savannah didn't know, something that would change everything. 24 hours, she'd said. But I'd already had 48. After their car disappeared down the street, I stood frozen in my living room, staring at the coffee table where Savannah had spread her poisonous documents like a virus contaminating everything they touched. The silence felt deafening after their threats, broken only by the steady tick of the grandfather clock Thomas had inherited from his father. I walked to the kitchen on unsteady legs and gripped the edge of the counter, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold myself upright. The woman in the reflection of the kitchen window looked ancient, defeated, exactly like the helpless victim Savannah had painted me to be. Was this really who I'd become? Some pathetic old woman who could be manipulated and discarded by her own son. The tears came suddenly and violently. 48 hours of suppressed fear and betrayal pouring out of me like a dam had burst. I sank into one of the kitchen chairs, where Brandon used to sit as a little boy, telling me about his day at school, while I made his afternoon snack. That sweet, loving child had grown into a man who could look me in the eye and threaten to have me declared incompetent. I cried for the son I'd lost somewhere along the way, for the trust that had been shattered beyond repair, and for Thomas, who wasn't here to protect me from this nightmare. Most of all, I cried for myself, for feeling so utterly alone and powerless in the home where I'd once felt safest. But as the tears subsided, something else began to surface through my grief. Anger, pure, righteous fury at being treated like a doddering fool by people who had no idea what I was truly capable of. I wiped my eyes and walked to Thomas's study, where his presence always felt strongest. The room was exactly as he'd left it the morning he died. His reading glasses on the desk, a half-finished crossword puzzle beside his favorite fountain pen, the leather chair still bearing the impression of his body. I sat in that chair and let his memory wash over me. "Thomas," I whispered to the empty room, "they think I'm some helpless old woman they can push around. They have no idea who they're dealing with, do they?" I could almost hear his voice responding. That mix of pride and amusement he'd always had when I surprised people with my strength. During our 42 years of marriage, Thomas had learned never to underestimate me. He'd seen me face down school board bullies when I was fighting for my students, watched me negotiate with contractors when we were renovating this house, admired my ability to research and plan and execute decisions that others thought were beyond me. "You're not just a retired teacher, Ellie," he used to say. "You're a strategist. You see 3 moves ahead while everyone else is still figuring out the rules of the game." Sitting in his chair, surrounded by his books and memories, I felt my backbone straightening for the first time in days. Savannah Reed had made a crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that because I was 68 and recently widowed, I was automatically vulnerable and confused. She'd counted on my love for Brandon to make me compliant, never imagining that same love might motivate me to fight back. But I wasn't the broken woman she thought she was manipulating. I was Eleanor Morrison, who had survived the death of her beloved husband, raised a successful son, and managed her own affairs competently for 2 years. I was a woman who had spent 4 decades teaching teenagers, which meant I had extensive experience dealing with manipulative, entitled behavior. More importantly, I was a woman who had seen this attack coming from miles away. Rising from Thomas's chair, I felt a cold clarity settle over me, like armor. Savannah had given me 24 hours to surrender, but she had no idea I'd already spent the previous 2 days preparing for war. 2 nights before Brandon and Savannah's ultimatum, I'd lain awake until 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling and finally accepting what my heart had been trying to tell me for weeks. My son was either being manipulated by a predator or had become one himself. And either way, I was in serious danger of losing everything Thomas and I had spent our lives building. That sleepless night had crystallized into action the next morning. While Brandon thought I was puttering around my garden and Savannah believed I was too confused to protect myself, I'd been executing a plan that would have made Thomas proud. My first stop had been Martin Reynolds' law office at 8:30 sharp. Martin had been Thomas's attorney and friend for over 20 years, and he'd handled our wills in estate planning since we were newlyweds. When I called and told him I needed to see him immediately about protecting my assets, he'd cleared his morning schedule without question. "Eleanor, what's brought this on?" he'd asked as I sat across from his mahogany desk, my hands surprisingly steady as I explained the situation. "Martin, I need to create an irrevocable trust with myself as the sole lifetime beneficiary. I want every asset Thomas and I accumulated transferred into that trust immediately, where no one can touch them without my explicit written consent and your co-signature as trustee." Martin had leaned back in his chair, his experienced eyes taking in the seriousness of my request. "That's a significant step, Eleanor. Once assets are in an irrevocable trust, even you can't easily access them without proper procedures." "That's exactly what I want," I'd replied firmly. "I also want to change my will completely, remove Brandon as primary beneficiary, and designate the Literacy Foundation, where I used to volunteer, as the main recipient of my estate." "Eleanor, are you certain about this? Disinheriting your son. My son is trying to have me declared incompetent so his girlfriend can steal everything I own," I'd interrupted. "I'm not disinheriting him out of spite, Martin. I'm protecting myself from theft." Martin had spent the next 4 hours helping me restructure my entire financial life. The house, my investment accounts, the life insurance policies, even my modest pension. Everything went into the Morrison Family Trust with ironclad language that required both my signature and Martin's approval for any major financial decisions. But the trust was only the beginning of my preparations. That afternoon, I'd driven to the office of Dr. Sarah Chen, a geriatrician who specialized in cognitive assessments for elderly patients. I'd made an appointment for a comprehensive mental competency evaluation, knowing that Savannah's greatest weapon would be claiming I was mentally unfit to make my own decisions. "Mrs. Morrison, your cognitive function tests are completely normal for someone your age," Dr. Chen had assured me after 2 hours of memory tests, problem-solving exercises, and mental acuity assessments. "In fact, your scores are above average. You're clearly capable of making your own financial and medical decisions." I'd requested multiple copies of her written assessment, along with a notarized statement attesting to my mental competency. If Savannah wanted to claim I was confused or diminished, she'd have to explain away professional medical evidence to the contrary. My third stop had been the most satisfying. I'd hired Patricia Williams, a private investigator who specialized in financial crimes against the elderly. Patricia had come highly recommended by Martin, who'd used her services in several elder abuse cases. "Give me 48 hours, Patricia had said after I'd explained the situation. "I'll find out everything there is to know about Savannah Reed." Her report, delivered the morning of Brandon and Savannah's visit, had been even more damning than I'd expected. Savannah's real name was Sarah Vandenberg, and she had a criminal history spanning 3 states. She'd been arrested twice for elder financial abuse, but had plea bargained both cases down to probation. Patricia had found evidence of at least 6 other elderly victims who'd lost significant assets to Savannah's schemes. The pattern was always the same: target a recently widowed woman through her adult children, gradually isolate the victim from friends and family, document alleged signs of mental incompetence, then swoop in with legal documents to assume control of the victim's assets. In 2 cases, the elderly victims had died under suspicious circumstances shortly after signing over their estates. "Mrs. Morrison," Patricia had said as she handed me the thick file of evidence, "this woman is extremely dangerous. She's not just after your money, she's a serial predator who destroys families for profit." But Patricia's investigation had also provided me with ammunition, bank records showing suspicious transfers from previous victims' accounts, court documents revealing Savannah's history of using false identities. Most importantly, recorded phone conversations where she discussed targeting the Morrison woman with what appeared to be an accomplice. By the time Brandon and Savannah had walked into my home with their threats and legal documents, I'd already moved every asset beyond their reach, proven my mental competency with medical documentation and gathered enough evidence to have Savannah arrested for conspiracy to commit elder abuse. They thought they were cornering a helpless old woman. Instead, they'd walked into a trap set by someone who'd had 2 days to prepare for their attack. The only question now was whether my son could be saved from the predator who'd sunk her claws into him, or if he'd chosen to become her willing accomplice in destroying his own mother. Either way, Savannah Reed had picked the wrong victim, and she was about to learn that some teachers never stop educating people about the consequences of their actions. The next morning, Brandon and Savannah returned at exactly 9 o'clock, clearly expecting to find a defeated woman ready to surrender her independence. I watched through my kitchen window as they approached my front door, Savannah carrying what appeared to be notarized documents, and Brandon holding a bouquet of flowers, probably meant to soften the blow of my capitulation. I let them knock twice before answering, taking my time to savor this moment I'd been anticipating since their threats the day before. When I opened the door, I was fully dressed in my best navy suit, my hair perfectly styled, and my makeup carefully applied. I wanted to look like anything but the confused, helpless woman they expected to find. "Good morning," I said pleasantly, stepping back to let them enter. "I assume you're here for my decision." Savannah's predatory smile was already in place as she moved toward my coffee table, spreading out what looked like the same power of attorney documents from yesterday, along with several new forms that appeared even more comprehensive. "Eleanor, I'm so glad you've come to your senses," she said, uncapping an expensive pen. "These documents will ensure you're properly cared for while protecting what's left of your assets. Brandon and I have already arranged for a lovely care provider to move in and help with your daily needs." A care provider, the final piece of their plan to strip away my independence completely. "That's very thoughtful," I replied, settling into Thomas's armchair with the calm confidence of someone holding all the cards. "But I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding." Brandon frowned, the flowers forgotten in his hands. "What kind of misunderstanding, Mom?" I smiled at my son, genuinely sorry for what I was about to do to him, but knowing it was the only way to save him from this predator's influence. "The misunderstanding is that you think I have assets for Savannah to manage." Savannah's pen stopped moving across the documents. "What do you mean?" "I mean that 2 days ago, I transferred every asset I own into an irrevocable trust with my attorney as co-trustee. The house, my bank accounts, my investments, even my life insurance policies. They're all beyond anyone's reach except mine and Martin Reynolds' joint approval." The silence that followed was deafening. Savannah's mask of false concern began to slip as the implications of my words sank in. "That's impossible," she said, her voice losing its honeyed tone. "You can't have done that. You don't have the mental capacity to make such complex legal decisions." I reached into the folder I'd prepared and pulled out Dr. Chen's assessment. According to this comprehensive cognitive evaluation I had done yesterday, my mental capacity is not only intact, but above average for my age group. Any claim of incompetence would have to contradict professional medical evidence. Brandon stared at the document as if it were written in a foreign language. "Mom, what have you done?" "I've protected myself, Brandon. Something I apparently needed to do from my own family." Savannah's composure cracked completely. "You manipulative old witch," she snarled, her true nature finally showing. "Do you have any idea how much money you've just cost us? United States." There it was, the admission that Brandon was her willing partner in this scheme, not just her victim. But my son's face told a different story. He looked genuinely shocked by Savannah's transformation, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time. "Savannah, what are you talking about?" he asked, taking a step back from her. I pulled out Patricia's investigation file. "Maybe this will help explain things, Brandon." As I spread the evidence across the coffee table, documenting Savannah's real identity, her criminal history, and her pattern of targeting elderly widows through their adult children. I watched my son's face cycle through disbelief, horror, and finally, devastation. Sarah Vandenberg. I read from the police reports, also known as Savannah Reed, Sandra Vale, and Susan Richards, arrested multiple times for elder financial abuse. Currently wanted for questioning in the suspicious death of Harold Patterson, age 73, who died 3 weeks after signing over his estate to her management. Brandon collapsed into the nearest chair, staring at the woman he thought he'd been in love with. Savannah, tell me this isn't true. But Savannah was past pretending now. Faced with exposure and the complete failure of her scheme, she turned vicious. Your precious mother isn't the saint you think she is, she spat. She's a bitter old woman, sitting on millions of dollars while her own son struggles. I was doing you a favor by stealing from my mother, by getting you what should have been yours anyway. Savannah grabbed her purse, her eyes wild with fury. You're both fools if you think this is over. I'll contest that trust. I'll have her declared incompetent regardless of some quack doctor's assessment. I stood up slowly, every inch the retired teacher who'd spent 40 years dealing with bullies and troublemakers. No, Savannah, you won't. Because in approximately 10 minutes, Detective Rodriguez from the county sheriff's office will be here to arrest you for conspiracy to commit elder abuse, identity fraud, and attempted theft. I called them this morning. The color drained from her face as the sound of sirens became audible in the distance. You set me up, she whispered. I protected myself. I corrected. Just like I should have done the moment you walked into my life. As the police cars pulled into my driveway, Brandon looked at me with tears streaming down his face. Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I thought she really cared about you. I looked at my son, seeing both the man who'd betrayed me and the boy I'd raised, and made a decision that would determine the future of our relationship. We'll see, Brandon. We'll see. 6 months after Savannah's arrest, I stood in my kitchen making Sunday morning pancakes for the first time since Thomas died. The familiar ritual of measuring flour and cracking eggs felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd lost somewhere in the chaos of grief and betrayal. Through the window, I could see Brandon in the backyard, carefully pruning the rose bushes Thomas had planted for our 20th anniversary. The road to this peaceful Sunday morning had been neither straight nor simple. After the police took Savannah away in handcuffs, Brandon had remained in my living room for 3 hours, alternately crying and asking questions I wasn't sure how to answer. How long had I known? Why hadn't I warned him? How could he have been so blind? Mom, I almost destroyed you, he'd whispered, his head in his hands. My own mother, and I almost let that woman steal everything Dad worked for. I'd wanted to comfort him, to tell him it was all Savannah's fault and he'd been an innocent victim. But that would have been a lie that served neither of us. Brandon was 42 years old, a grown man who'd made choices that had nearly cost me everything. Yes, you did almost destroy me, I'd said quietly. The question now is what you're going to do about it. The weeks that followed had been a masterclass in rebuilding trust from ashes. Brandon had insisted on entering therapy to understand how he'd been manipulated, but more importantly, to examine his own character flaws that had made him vulnerable to Savannah's influence. He'd been brutally honest about his resentment over helping me after Thomas died, his growing sense of entitlement to his inheritance, and his willingness to believe I was incompetent rather than face his own financial failures. I think part of me wanted to believe her, he'd admitted during one of our careful conversations. It was easier than admitting I'd failed as a businessman and needed my mother to bail me out. If you were incompetent, then I wasn't a 42-year-old man taking money from his widowed mother. His honesty was painful, but necessary. I couldn't rebuild a relationship with someone who wouldn't acknowledge what he'd done wrong. Martin Reynolds had helped me restructure the trust to include provisions for Brandon, but with strict conditions. He would receive a modest monthly allowance that increased based on demonstrable changes in his behavior and character. The bulk of my estate would still go to charity, but he could earn back a significant inheritance through consistent proof that he valued me as a person, not just as a source of money. It's not punishment, I'd explained to him. It's protection, for both of us. Brandon had accepted these terms without argument, something the old Brandon never would have done. He'd sold his failing construction business and taken a job with a local contractor, earning a steady, if modest, income that required no financial assistance from me. More importantly, he'd started showing up, not when he needed something, but simply because he wanted to spend time with his mother. The Sunday visits had resumed 3 months ago, but they were different now. Instead of perfunctory conversations filled with unspoken expectations, we talked about books, gardening, memories of Thomas, and Brandon's journey toward becoming the man his father had raised him to be. He'd started calling me every Wednesday evening, not to ask for anything, but to check on my well-being and share stories from his week. 2 weeks ago, he'd brought me a small wooden jewelry box he'd made in his spare time, carved with roses to match Thomas's garden. Inside was a note that read, "For the strongest woman I know. Thank you for saving me from myself. Love, your son." I cried when I read it, not from sadness, but from recognition. This was the Brandon I remembered from his childhood, the boy who'd made me Mother's Day cards and proudly brought home straight A's. Savannah's predation had awakened something dark in him, but underneath, the good man Thomas and I had raised was still there. The legal aftermath had been satisfying in ways I hadn't expected. Savannah, now facing charges in multiple states, had been sentenced to 8 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution to her victims. The trial had received significant media coverage, which led to other families coming forward with similar stories. My willingness to prosecute had apparently broken open a much larger investigation into elder abuse networks. As I flipped the pancakes, I reflected on how much my life had changed since that terrifying morning, when strangers had walked into my home with plans to steal my independence. I'd discovered strengths I didn't know I possessed, and learned that protecting yourself wasn't selfish. It was necessary. The kitchen timer chimed, and I called out to Brandon that breakfast was ready. He came in from the garden with dirt under his fingernails and Thomas's old gardening hat on his head, looking more like the son I remembered than he had in years. "The roses are going to be beautiful this summer," he said, washing his hands at the sink. "Dad would be proud of how well you've maintained his garden." "Your father would be proud of a lot of things," I replied, placing a stack of pancakes in front of him. As we ate breakfast in comfortable silence, I felt Thomas's presence in the room more strongly than I had since his death. Not the sad, mourning presence of early grief, but the warm satisfaction of a job well done. We'd raised a good son who'd lost his way for a while, but found his path back to the values we'd taught him. Later that afternoon, after Brandon left with promises to return the following Sunday, I sat in my garden with a cup of tea and my watercolor paints. I'd taken up painting again after Savannah's arrest, finding peace in creating something beautiful after surviving something so destructive. The house behind me stood solid and secure, still filled with 40 years of love and memories, still mine. The trust documents locked in Martin's safe ensured it would remain so. But more than the legal protections, I'd learned to trust my own instincts, to value my own worth, and to understand that love without respect wasn't love at all. As the sun set over Thomas's roses, I painted the scene before me, my home, my garden, my life reclaimed. In the corner of the canvas, I added a small signature, Eleanor Morrison, age 68, still learning, still growing, still here. I was exactly where I belonged. And for the first time since Thomas died, I was truly at peace.